All right, guys, today I want to say a little bit about a concept called the shadow, and I want to situate it more broadly in what Carl Jung referred to as archetypes. Although we could teach an entire course and probably multiple courses on Carl Jung's depth psychology, today we're just going to scratch the surface. And before we do, I want to make explicit the connection that I'm trying to make here between the shadow and what we've talked about before as self-compassion. One of my suggestions is that when we talk about some shadow work, which we will in just a little bit today, this is one of the methods whereby you could increase self-compassion. So in my what, why, and how for self-compassion, what I want to note is shadow work is one of the ways that you could do this. So I want to tell you a little bit more specifically about what shadow work is, what the shadow is in particular. All of this comes from work by a man named Carl Jung, who you've likely read about and heard lectured about, especially those of you who took clinical psychology, or clinical and community interventions rather. But what Jung found was that in his travels to multiple different cultures, some industrialized, many non-industrialized, what he found was that time and time again in the stories and the myths that these cultures would tell, he found consistent characters and themes cropping up. And it was these characters and themes that he called archetypes. So today I want to go through a few of these archetypes and spend much of our time talking in particular about the shadow. Now, we could use all sorts of contemporary examples to do this. We could talk about Harry Potter, we could go to Lord of the Rings. If any of you guys ever watched the show Lost, we could do that. In many, many different films, movies, books, you can find these kind of Jungian archetypes. But today, for our example, we're going to go with a completely and wonderfully nerdy example, geeky example. We're going to go with, we could do Harry Potter, but instead we're going to go with Star Wars. So we want to talk a little bit through Star Wars. If you've not yet seen it, this is a film that I'm thinking about requiring future classes to watch, but go back and watch it. You got some time on your hands these days. So in using Star Wars, I want us to think about each one of the characters as an example of an archetype. So what Jung found is that in classic myths from different cultures, there would be particular roles that or particular character types that would crop up. So I want to begin with the primary one, which is the hero. So the hero is the protagonist or a central character in a story that in some way or another is separated from the ordinary world. Now, in the case of Star Wars, this happens when Luke, in fact, first is somewhat separated as an orphan himself. In fact, what we find is that many heroes end up playing the role of orphan. But he's separated from the world a bit to begin with as an orphan, but later on becomes even more separated when his aunt and his uncle are killed by the evil empire. So he's separated from the ordinary world and is called upon to sacrifice himself for a particular kind of journey or quest. Now, the hero is a hero in part because he's one who answers this challenge when it comes up. And so in the case of Star Wars, Luke answers the challenge instead of staying at his home planet and farming and then going off to school or the military academy to answer the challenge to go with this strange old man to try to rescue a princess somewhere in the far reaches of the galaxy. In other words, the hero completes the quest, and in the end, the calling of this hero is to complete a quest that's going to restore some kind of balance to the ordinary world. In the movie The Star Wars, this is actually explicit language that's used with respect to the Force. They need to restore balance. And usually in most stories, we experience the journey through the eyes of the hero. What I'd suggest to you is that in your own lives, as if I were to ask you to tell me the story of how you got to be where you are today, many of you would tell your story from the perspective of the hero. So I want you to think about your own life, how you think about yourself, the challenges that you've met or you failed to leave, through the lens of the hero. Okay? And then I want you to think about each one of these additional roles in two different ways. So I'm going to talk about some other archetypes. One is the classic way that we're used to thinking about this, which is each one of these additional roles could be a person outside of our lives that influences our heroic journey. Okay, that's the way that stories are told. That's the way in which Star Wars is told. In Star Wars, there are multiple different characters, each of whom fulfill particular roles. But I want you also, at a second level, to begin thinking about some of these outside characters as dimensions or parts of yourself. This is one of Jung's great insights, is that we all carry with us some of these different dimensions in our own life. So let's dive in and talk briefly about a couple of heroes, or about a couple different characters or archetypes, and we'll end on the shadow, and that's where we'll pick up the next lecture. Okay, in addition to the hero, there's oftentimes in stories the trickster or the comic. The trickster or the comic plays a particular role, and that's usually to disrupt the status quo in some way or another. It takes what is otherwise an ordinary day or an ordinary world into chaos. In Star Wars, this happens when these two droids bumble into Luke's life. One of them runs away from his farm, and he's got to go off and search, and it's these tricksters and comics who end up bringing him in contact with another character, the wise old wizard. Okay, so typically the trickster or the comic may not change or develop throughout the course of the series. In fact, in all 9 Star Wars movies, these two characters tend not to change very much. You tend to find the same R2-D2, the same C-3PO in the very first 3 movies as you do in the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th movies. But what does happen is that in the midst of their journey, these tricksters tend to change the world. They tend to transform the world and its inhabitants. And oftentimes what we'll find, especially in the case of these two characters, the trickster uses laughter and ridicule to make characters see the absurdity of the current situation. And that sometimes this is enough to get those characters to change themselves. An additional role or an additional archetype is that of the mentor. Or another trickster that comes in later films is Yoda. Now, Yoda also happens to play a second role in these films, and that is of the mentor. In the early film, the first film, this is played by Obi-Wan Kenobi, and in later films, this is played by Yoda. The mentor, which can also overlap with some other archetypes, tends to provide motivation for the primary character, the hero. They offer insights into the world in general, and oftentimes into the hero's own character that hero needs to hear. And typically it's the mentor or mentors that offer training to help the hero. So I want you to think just a moment in your own life. Who are the people who have mentored you? If you were to tell the story of your own life, what mentor or mentor figures might you name? The next is a really unique archetype that Jung noticed, which is actually 2 archetypes, that of the animus and that of the anima. So it's helpful to briefly distinguish these two. The animus is, instead of a male person, it's the unconscious masculine side of a female. In other words, the animus is masculine, and the animus tends to be represented by qualities like assertiveness, courage, analytical thought, strength, vitality, decisiveness, focused attentiveness, a desire for achievement. These are stereotypically masculine qualities. That doesn't mean male. That means masculine. They tend to get associated with males. The anima is what Jung referred to as the unconscious feminine side of a male. Qualities such as feelings and emotions and tenderness and relatedness, commitment, fidelity, friendship, love, all of these ones listed here, these are more stereotypically feminine traits, but they're traits that exist in both males and in females. So in stories and in films, you may have an animus character, a masculine male character, and you may have an anima character, a female character that embodies some of these traits, but in the individual psyche, what Jung believed is we each possess a masculine and feminine side of our own qualities. So I want you to think in your own life, think of stereotypically masculine characters in your own story. Who are the people who, for you, really give voice to the sense of assertiveness or courage or strength or vitality? It also could be a more detached, analytical, rational thought process. And who are the people in your life who tend to embody things like feelings and emotions and relatedness, imagination, curiosity, creativity? The second layer you want to think about is, what are these dimensions like in you? And which of these two do you tend to identify with more intensely? For most people in most cultures, males tend to identify more with their animus than with the anima. Not all people, and certainly not to all the same degrees. Whereas females stereotypically tend to identify more with the feminine side. But what Jung is going to suggest is that we each have these qualities to ourselves. Okay, the next is the herald. The herald doesn't have to be a person. It can be even an event or a non-specific force, like the start of a war or a drought or a famine. But it's something that happens that announces a change. So for instance, in Star Wars, this change might happen in bits when Luke realizes the death of his aunt and his uncle. This announces that something here has changed and that people can't go on, that he can't go on in the same way in his life that he could before. Sometimes a herald might even wear a mask, but it typically tends to issue some kind of challenge. In Star Wars, this challenge is issued: you have to come with me and learn the ways of the Force. At this point, the herald can make their appearance anytime, but usually they appear in the beginning of the journey, and that's what actually announces the call to adventure or the request for the hero to join the quest. The next character is what's referred to as the shapeshifter. This is a character or characters in a story whose allegiance is ambiguous. In Star Wars, this role is fulfilled in part by Han Solo. He seems to be good, but you never quite know if he's going to just be in it for himself. The shapeshifter's mask, oftentimes they'll wear a mask, tends to mislead the hero by hiding the character's intentions and loyalties. So throughout the early part of this film, we see Han Solo as someone who's just in it for himself, but in the end ends up showing more of his good side, more generosity, more selflessness than we initially see. But typically, the shapeshifter's alliances, when they're uncertain and when we're not quite sure whether to believe his claims, are forces that keep the hero off guard. In other words, the hero never quite knows how to depend on the shapeshifter, and it keeps it a dynamic quest. An additional archetype is the archetype of the threshold guardian. Now, the threshold guardian is oftentimes a character that protects the world in some way or another from the hero, typically from people in general, but from the hero in particular. This one is fulfilled, especially in the second and third films, by the character of Yoda, who protects the secrets of the Force from Luke, and Luke has to pass particular kinds of tests in order to show his commitment and worth for the journey. Now, the last archetype is that of the shadow. And we'll spend a little bit more time in the next lecture talking about it, but to briefly introduce it, the shadow is the opposite of the hero in one or more ways. In fact, typically, the shadow character in a story or a myth is determined to destroy the hero and whatever cause the hero stands for. In the case of Star Wars, this is best personified by Darth Vader, later on by the Emperor, who is determined to destroy not only Luke, but the rebellion in general. What Jung suggests is that the shadow can typically represent our darkest desires, or, as we'll talk about later, even our untapped resources or our personal rejected qualities. The hero's enemies and the villains oftentimes wear a mask, as we see in Star Wars. We see a literal shadow mask on Darth Vader. And the curious part about the shadow is that the shadow character usually sees himself or herself as a hero. and sees the story's hero, in this case, Luke Skywalker, as a villain, as someone who needs to be overcome or destroyed. So in the next lecture, we'll spend a little bit more time diving into this character of the shadow, and then I'll unpack why I think this is important for us as we think about self-compassion and our journeys of growth.